This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey everyone, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary based on a real-life serial killer. And this is one that I have actually not seen before. And this will probably be another lengthy video because it is another 4-part docu-series on Netflix. It's one I've scrolled past a few times but never actually watched it. It's one of the few that I haven't already seen on Netflix. Being Netflix means there's no DVD of it, which I really would like to get. But this is one that was put out by Raw TV. I'm not quite sure between like Raw TV, All 3 Media. That I think they're all intertwined somehow. But I've seen other Raw TV documentaries that have been put to Netflix. I think the Night Stalker one is Raw TV, but I could be wrong. Don't F with Cats, which I haven't seen yet, but I am familiar with the case of Luka Magnotta. I did watch Most Hated Man on the internet just as curiosity. It's not one I feel like reviewing, but that was interesting. They did the Dennis Nielsen tapes, which I have reviewed, and I thought there was more that I've seen. I'm sure there's more that I've seen. But I was thinking about the Night Stalker one because that was the one that came to mind when I came across this. And I was wondering if it was going to be similar to that. But it dropped on Netflix on the 16th of December 2020, and it is The Ripper, which is a 4-part docuseries on one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, the Yorkshire Ripper, also, or real name Peter Sutcliffe, and how between 1975 and January of 81, he murdered 13 women, mostly prostitutes. And I wasn't quite sure which direction this was going to go in. Well, actually, first, it was directed by Jesse Vile and Elena Wood. Contains 4 episodes. There's not really much on it as far as that goes. But, so I was thinking of the Night Stalker one because I was pretty sure that was Raw TV. And I was wondering if it was going to be more like that, like just the investigation, which most things I've seen on Peter Sutcliffe happens to be about the investigation. Unless it's like a true crime program, like Born to Kill, Program to Kill, World's Most Evil Serial Killers. Those are all about Sutcliffe. But I know there's a film called Peter, which is sort of like a portrait of a serial killer type film, not very accurate. But I have seen This Is Personal, The Search for the Yorkshire Ripper, or The Hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. And that is all about the investigation. Sutcliffe doesn't even come into the last 7 minutes. I was wondering if it was going to take that approach, which it did have a subtitle, The Hunt, The Hunt, searching, finding, the investigation. And he did have a subtitle like the Night Stalker one did, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. So I thought, oh, maybe this will actually be about Peter Sutcliffe. And I think for that reason alone, it is an investigative procedural. It is all about the investigation and pretty much how it's one of the most notoriously flawed police investigations, at least in the history of like serial killer investigations. But I'm sure some people will see it and then not like it. I know a lot of people did not like the Night Stalker one on Netflix because it wasn't a Richard Ramirez portrait. This one is definitely not Peter Sutcliffe. In fact, this has less on Sutcliffe than the Night Stalker one did on Ramirez, which was not very much. Sutcliffe is talked about very, very briefly at the end of episode 4. We get a few photos of him. It doesn't really go into his childhood or his life or really much of anything. It really just says Peter Sutcliffe, 35, lorry driver. Talks about how it was the voice of God that made him do it. He heard it when he was a grave digger, when he was younger. That's kind of the extent of what we get into his life. Oh, also, his wife Sonia. That's pretty much all it goes into. Pretty much the 3 episodes and like 90% of the last episode is all about the investigation, which is fine. I'm just as intrigued by the investigation side as I am the killer side. And I've seen. Sorry, I'm wheezing so much. um, you know, and I don't have any books specifically on Sutcliffe or the Yorkshire Ripper. I have a list of about a bunch of books on him. I know there's a lot. I will pick them up. But I just grabbed 3 random serial killer encyclopedic books, and he's in there. He is very notorious. He's in a lot of the books I have. I have read a lot about him. So there were a lot of things going into it that I already knew. Normally, I would say if you've already read some things or listen to podcasts or seen documentaries, it might not be that illuminating. Here, though, it actually leaves a lot out. I mean, watching stuff like this and reading more about the investigation, the film This Is Personal is actually fairly accurate as far as events that happened and tactics they used in the investigation. It's fairly accurate. So there's a lot in this documentary that it leaves out. Um, it leaves out a lot of the times that Sutcliffe was interviewed by police. It mentions it. It mentions he was interviewed 9 separate times. I think I'll probably go into it more when I go through my notes and it jogs my memory more. But there are a lot of things. Also, George Oldfield, who was the lead investigator, it doesn't really go into him that much. It leaves out that he had a heart attack. It leaves out that the father of one of the victims died 2 years later of a heart attack. So it does leave a lot out even still, but it's still informative for what it is. And normally I would say, well, judging by the subtitle, you should know that this is not the serial killer documentary. It's about the hunt or the search. But this doesn't have that subtitle. It's just The Ripper. There are some times where it will make comparisons to Jack the Ripper, which also it doesn't even give a conclusion to the hoax of the letters and audio tape that was sent to the police during this time. In fact, I think it just, in passing, mentions, I think this might be a hoax. It doesn't really come out and say it was a hoax. Years later, in 2005, I think it was, 2005 or 2008, we caught this guy. He was the one that sent the letters and the tape. No resolution on that. But like always, it is presented very, very well. The interviews all look really good. They're shot really well. Of course, we get interviews from some of the family members of victims, a lot of the journalists and reporters around at that time, a lot of the top officers that are still alive. No George Oldfield, who passed away. Jim Hobson, I believe, passed away. I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Ridgway. Of course, I remember that. I think he was even above. I think he was above everyone. I think he passed away. But you get people like I think his name's Keith Hellawell, Andy Leptu, who he wasn't high up, but he was involved. Interview with the arresting officer of Peter Sutcliffe. So you do get interviews like with media people, law enforcement people, family members and friends of victims. So you do get a good assortment of people involved. Now, the only thing I did know about this docuseries before going into it was when I was doing reading for Ted Bundy Falling for a Killer, for that review, I saw that it brought up how there was a lot of focus on feminism and how it's been compared to this series. So I knew at some point it was going to have a lot of focus on feminism. And if you go to IMDb, a lot of people hate this documentary for that reason, calling it the woke Ripper, or the Wokeshire Ripper, say how it gets hijacked in the third episode. I highly disagree because feminism is a huge integral part to this story. Now, for the first two episodes, it's pretty subtle. We get an interview with, I believe it's a journalist, a female journalist. Uh, there's also an interview with a female forensic lab technician, and they talk about how they were like the only women in that field, how people didn't really uh, didn't have a lot of confidence in them. The lab tech, she even says how her first crime scene was Helen Ritka. But the reporter talks about how it was always men that did these major crime stories. Women couldn't do them, so she wanted to do it. But then there's this other woman, Joan Smith, who I think was a reporter for radio. She comes in episode 3, and yeah, she really breaks down the feminism, like how male journalists talked about how it's men. This man hates prostitutes, so be a good girl, or like these women don't matter. But this good girl, Jane McDonald, who was 16, not a prostitute, she was a good girl. It's tragic that she was killed. You know, she kind of makes it seem like the media was trying to keep women in their place. That's what she points out. It does, but also there was a lot of the feminist marches and movements going on at that time. The movement called Reclaim the Night, which is the name of episode 3. It really goes into that. Women, because pretty much police were just telling women, don't go out at night. If you don't go out at night, you can't get killed. And they thought that was kind of, it's like, well, if you did your job, then we could go out at night. But, it goes into that, has footage of all the marches. But also it goes into not just the police, but the laissez-faire attitude of the public. How people really didn't give a shit that these prostitutes were being killed at first. It wasn't until Jane McDonald, the 16-year-old, who I believe was the 5th victim, but I could be wrong, that's when people started caring, but not enough to step forward. So I would actually say that the angle of feminism is actually more relevant to the story in this than in the Ted Bundy one. I get why it's in the Ted Bundy one as sort of like a juxtaposition, but here it's actually related to the story. It's an integral part of the story. So the angle of feminism that everyone seems to hate, it actually makes sense that it's in here. It's a major part of the story. But it goes into pretty much all the flaws that the police made in this investigation. It goes into the, all the door-to-door inquiries. It goes really into the 5-pound note, which anyone that's read about this case knows about the 5-pound note. The crazy idea of Project R, which is playing the tape everywhere. Shopping centers, clubs, on the radio, on TV, a phone line so you can hear it. Putting up huge billboards, asking the public to help out. And it really paints the wrong way to do a police investigation, which is they have these clues, they have these leads, they're trying to make the end result, the killer, fit that narrative. They're trying to make the killer or the outcome of the investigation fit these clues. It goes into how with the tape, experts said he has a Geordie accent. So anyone comes forward and saying, I was attacked by this guy. Well, did he have a Geordie accent? No, he had a Yorkshire accent. Well, that's not our guy, so you don't want to talk to us. A lot of stuff like that, or I was attacked. Well, you're not a prostitute, so, this isn't a Yorkshire a Ripper concern. And how that, a lot of eyewitness stuff was left out. It really goes into a lot of the faux pas and just one of the most botched investigations, I think, in serial killer investigative history. But it's still a fascinating story. It's still done very well. It does have a lot of dramatizations, mostly just like a car being parked or kind of trolling in like a back alley or like a residential area or a back road at night, kind of creeping along. But the way it's shot is very David Fincher looking. It looks awesome. It looks a lot like Mindhunter. So, and it's like any other serial killer docu series where you kind of see like the back of the head or they're out of focus, you can't make out the person, and that's fine. Um, but yeah, I thought. Uh, oh, and also, uh, whenever we get into a victim, the first time their name is said, we'll get big letters on the screen, then a black and white photo, and then we'll get a map of Yorkshire. And there'll be the picture in their name wherever they are. Like, okay, these ones were in Bradford, these were in Leeds, this one was in Manchester, or these were in Manchester. So it gives us the layout, but also when it's up close of a victim's picture, there'll be like a sticky note where it has the date and how long it's been since the previous one. I like that touch. So there's still a lot of these Netflix documentaries. Visuals like that, I think, have all been fairly original. I mean, the closest will probably be the Son of Sam one, which I'm watching now, where it has a map and like a date and how many days since the last one. But I liked that having the photos with the sticky note, how many days since the previous attack. It's shot very, very well. You do get a ton of footage, whether it be news footage, old archive uh, documentary footage, or like uh, crime scene evidence footage. You get a ton of that, a ton of news footage, lots of archive interviews from that period. So it does go very in depth, but there's still a lot of details that I noticed that was in other things that are kind of glossed over or not gone into that deeply. Like with the whole thing about the right boot print having less pronounced tread. So they were wondering, well, it's got to be a job where he's using his right foot a lot. Someone just kind of lightly talks about that. It doesn't go into the number of different suspects that they had. Of course, that were all wrong. And again, if you didn't like the Night Stalker one for how little they talked about Ramirez, they talk about Sutcliffe even less. So, I mean, real true crime enthusiasts are still going to find this fascinating. Even if it doesn't illuminate a lot, they'll still find it interesting. But I can see a lot of people, one, thinking it's woke just because it goes into feminism as relevant to the story as it is, or wishing it went more into Sutcliffe because that's what they want to see. But I love the investigative side just as much as the killer aspect. It's not one of the better Netflix docs I've seen. Like just a serial killer like docu-series, multi-parts. All three conversations with the killer I liked more. Uh, the confession killer I liked more. I just started the Son of Sam one. I won't get to the Unabomber one. It's not one of the better ones, but it's still worth your time if you're into this story. Uh, you can watch anything like Born to Kill, World's Most Evil Serial Killers for Peter Sutcliffe. But I would say watching this along with the TV movie This Is Personal will probably be a good, of course, probably 7-hour endeavor, but, it's fairly accurate and it fleshes out a lot of things that are kind of left out from this. But even though it's not one of the best, I still thought it was decent. It's shot very well edited, plenty of audio and footage from that period. The David Fincher-esque dramatizations that are shot that help link it all together. The way the victims' names and photos pop up, the map that they're on. Also, whenever someone in the audio says something and there's like a key thing they say, that sentence will kind of pop up one word at a time. Like, and that is where we found a brand new £5 note. On the screen that's where we found a brand new £5 note. So it kind of lets you know when these key things to remember are going to pop up. Uh, so yeah, not one of the better ones, but I still thought it was decent. So yeah, that is Netflix's The Ripper. So with that, I guess we'll get into the summary and then I apologize again, the very long list of all the things that this documentary covers. So as always, I like to give a brief history on the killer that the film or documentary is based on. Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper, is one of Britain's most notorious serial killers and the focus of one of the biggest manhunts in the country's history. Between 1975 and 1981, Sutcliffe killed and mutilated 13 women, mostly prostitutes, and attacked at least 7 others, going back as far as 1969. He would approach them, strike them in the back of the head with a hammer, stab them multiple times, on one occasion at least 56 times, then pull up their shirts and pull down their skirts or pants, exposing their bodies. At least one was disemboweled. It is believed his hatred for prostitutes began over a dispute over payment. At one point, letters and an audio tape was sent to police, but it was later proven to be a hoax. Throughout the 5-year case, the police departments involved received mountains of backlash, with lead investigator George Oldfield receiving the brunt of it. On top of not being respected within the force itself. Their over-reliance on clues and incorrect information, such as the Geordie accent on the tape, along with only taking witness statements from prostitutes and ignoring those of other women, was more so an investigation of trying to make the killer fit the narrative, or the narrative fit the clues. There was also a laissez-faire attitude from the public and the media towards the prostitutes killed, only caring when more, quote, higher-class women were killed. Sutcliffe was arrested in January of 1981 and said the voice of God made him kill. He was attacked several times in prison, losing his vision in one eye on one occasion in 1997. In 1984, he was moved to Broadmoor Hospital for his paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis and sent back to prison in 2016. He died at the age of 74 on November 13, 2020, of complications to COVID, but also suffers from diabetes and a supposed heart attack. And so we'll go into what the series covers. Episode 1 is called Once Upon a Time in Yorkshire, which is a great title. And we start off 1975 in Leeds, Northern England. We're introduced to Andy Laptew, who was a rookie at the time of West Yorkshire Police. He goes into his position at the time and getting a call to the discovery of Wilma McCann's body. And she will go on to be the first victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. The first known victim, we get news audio footage and footage of the search. There's a ton of footage in here. I mean, it almost feels like there was just a documentary going on the entire time. And you know, when they did searches, they were like in long lines of like dozens of them, like taking inch steps to get footage of how they searched the area. We're introduced to Richard McCann, who was her son, and he goes into what he remembers from that day, waking up, his mom not being there, hearing the commotion outside, the police taking him inside his house, to ask him some questions. I think he was like 5 or 6 at this time. Uh, they said how they gave him hot cocoa, and then told him how, mom's been taken to heaven, and how they will never see her again. So we're introduced to Mike Green, who's the forensic pathologist, and each time we get into a murder, he comes up after each one to pretty much tell us the wounds that were found, any kind of similarities from crime to crime. He kind of lays all that out for us. So Mike Green, forensic pathologist, he goes into Wilma McCann's wounds, struck twice in the back of the head, stabbed twice in the breast, one in the abdomen, her top pulled up. It's not known yet, but that would go on to be his typical MO. And no evidence was left. More news footage of the door-to-door inquiry in Chapeltown. it goes into the socioeconomic decline of Chapeltown, how it was something of a ghetto, people were very uncooperative, and so that made the inquiry difficult. And then it goes into Wilma McCann being a prostitute. A couple newspaper people on how at first a prostitute being murdered wasn't really high priority news. No one really cared. They even called it a fish and chip story because you read it on Monday and then Tuesday or Wednesday you're wrapping your fish and chips with it. Like, no one really cared. Uh, Richard McCann on his rough childhood and his mother's life, poverty, foster homes, divorce, then arriving at the children's home after her murder. Uh, how difficult it goes into how difficult stranger murders are, like people murdered by people that they don't know because there's no one to link them to the murder, and it goes into the lack of empathy from the public, and again how no one really cared, and how they thought this was just a one-off murder. So we go to January of '76, a body of 40-year-old Emily Jackson, who was a mother of three. She was found behind a bakery near Chapeltown. You get news footage of that. It goes into her life as a prostitute. Neil Jackson, her son, is interviewed. He talks about being 17 at the time and being told that she was killed and a prostitute. He didn't even know that she was a prostitute. So he goes into finding out both at the same time and having to go identify the body. He said she was stabbed some 56 times. Mike Green on being stabbed with a screwdriver, because that's another thing that Sutcliffe would do. He didn't just use a knife. He would stab with a... I've read screwdriver. I've also read like a filed down, sharpened screwdriver. But Mike Green also mentions the size 7 boot that was found, boot print found on her thigh. It goes into the downfall of industrial England, and then April of '77, body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson found, how it was found, and now a pattern is seen. And also, every time there's a new victim, we get big letters, white letters, a black screen, and then a black and white photo. And it then shows the map of Yorkshire, where they were found, and it groups all the like towns or townships together, like Leeds, Manchester, Bradford. And when it shows the close-up, it'll show the picture of the victim with like a sticky note with the date and how many days since the previous one. So a pattern is starting to be seen. This is the first time the Ripper was used. It makes comparisons to Jack the Ripper. It goes into Jack the Ripper a little bit with photos of his victims and news articles from 1888. Jim Hobson, it goes into how Jim Hobson was promoted to Detective Chief Superintendent of Leeds, news footage of him. Lap 2 on how he joined police. Keith Hellawell, the Superintendent of Bradford, on how he joined. It goes into the different police forces in different cities with footage, photos, maps, and how by 1974, all forces were kind of put together to one, and now they have a serial killer. Tire marks found, plate numbers, and registrations of vehicles seen in Chapeltown's red light district are taken down. That was one of the first things they started doing. They would just sit in the red light district and they would be like, okay, that's a blue Buick plate number, and then they would go up and they'd get the a registration. That way they can see if there's any repeat clients. April of '77, John Domale, the Detective Chief Superintendent of Bradford, on 33-year-old Patricia Atkinson being found. She was the first one at Bradford, with news footage, footage of Domale. Green on Atkinson being the first killed in a flat. It was a derelict flat. Boot prints left. how the boot prints went to the door, then back to the body, as if the person set the body up, went to go leave, looked at it, and then walked back, and then repositioned her in a different way. Uh, and how the boot prints matched those left at the site of Emily Jackson. Then we're introduced to Krista Ackroyd, who was a Halifax courier, on wanting to be a reporter at 18 years old, and how women at the time weren't or couldn't do murder stories. They always did like weddings and really kind of the pieces that no one wanted to read. The more murder stories, the more sensational stories always went to male reporters. And that's kind of like the first glimpse into the feminism angle that the series is going to go to. It's very subtle at first. Like we have her, and then I think there's a lab tech at first. But then when we get to episode 3, it's really going to go into the feminism. But also she goes into how it's male reporters, and the way they're reporting it is saying how this man hates prostitutes, as if to say, in her words, as if to say, this guy hates bad girls, so be a good girl. That's kind of what she said. That's the vibe that the papers were putting out at the time. June 1977, the body of 16-year-old Jane McDonald was found. Shows photos and footage. Now, for anyone that's seen the film, the TV film, This Is Personal, the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper, this is where the film starts, with the murder of 16-year-old Jane McDonald. And this is when things are going to change, not just for the case, but the public's eye as well. Goes to how the body was dragged to the dump site, archive interview with her mother, it goes into how she wasn't a prostitute. She worked late at the supermarket and walked home. That's when she was attacked. Footage of the fear of women in the area, no longer just prostitutes. Ackroyd on how the papers called Jane the first innocent life taken, as if to say, she's not a whore or a prostitute. So yeah, she's innocent. And also how earlier the earlier murders of the prostitutes were like put in the back of the paper. Now Jane McDonald is like front page. This was the first time a victim was put on the front page. It goes into George Oldfield, Western Yorkshire Chief Inspector, now appointed to Senior Investigating Officer. He's now in charge of everything. But it does go into the politics of him being put in charge and being brought in as a leader and kind of pushing out top officers where he is, because they brought him in from a different department. So it goes into the politics of that and how a lot of people thought he was not suitable for the job. Thought that he, might have too much on his plate, bit off more than he could chew, and other cliches. So it goes into that, how he's unfit. The identification of blood and body fluids in the 1970s says how 50% were group O. That was the most common, then A, then B, then AB. And out of 60 million people with no semen, saliva, or blood samples, they really got nothing to work with. It goes into a letter to the Ripper in the Yorkshire Evening Post, talking to him directly, talking the murders, but emphasizing the murder of Jane McDonald. July 1977 in Bradford, Maureen Long was struck in the back of the head, stabbed 4 to 5 times, 5 times, but she survived. She's the first survivor since the case started. Now you'll find out that she's not the first survivor in general, but just since the death of Wilma McCann, she's the first survivor. But it goes into how, that's where episode 1 ends. So it just ends with how now they have a survivor. But episode 2, which is called Between Now and Dawn, it goes into Maureen Long's survival, leapt to taking her out to the bar to see if she could spot her attacker. Uh, Supposed brain damage made her unable to remember anything. Gives news footage, an old interview with Long. Uh, October 1977, the body of Jean Jordan is found 9 days after she disappeared. Uh, Bruce Jones, who's actually an actor, I can't remember anything he was in, but he would go on to be an actor. He's interviewed and he goes into how he found her. He was doing some yard work in this area. He come up by this shed, this greenhouse or this shed, and he found her naked body. Her hair was burnt, face smashed in, breasts cut off, and she was disemboweled. So he called it in. Agreed on how her being part of the series. The only difference is that she was the only one so far to be found in Manchester. Also agreed on how some of the slash marks were post-mortem. The body was originally under a hedge, but sometime later the killer returned, uh, moved her out in the open, mutilated her further. Suspected to be looking for something, but couldn't find what he was looking for because her handbag had been dumped out. But they noticed that there was a hidden pocket inside her purse where they found a brand new, freshly minted £5 note. And this will be the biggest clue probably in the whole investigation. Also, I might have mentioned this before in my actual review for it, but whenever someone being interviewed says a key piece of something, the words will come up on the screen as they say it. So, like, brand new £5 note. Because it goes into how they can be traced. They have serial numbers, news footage of DeMail saying that they found the note and looking into where, not where it came from, but where it could have been distributed. Because I think they could see if it was like a payroll note. So they started that large inquiry, seeing all the possible workplaces that it could have been distributed to, and then interviewing each and every single employee at those places. And how this was the biggest clue or lead that they've had. Footage of the factories that they looked into for distribution. It goes into the great number of inquiries and interviews of all the employees at these places. And then it takes a side note, and it goes into what was going on in the area economically, like how price of oil went up, inflation went up. There was a lot of strikes, change of values, like people were living together, not getting married, having children out of wedlock, and it was being accepted. And some of the people being interviewed are saying how it was seen as the downfall of society. But now there's a serial killer out there with footage of English life and the punk movement, which I kind of thought was funny. And it actually has some of the same punk footage as the Sex Pistols documentary, The Filth and the Fury. None of the Sex Pistols, but just some of the people in the movement. Which I was wondering if late 70s England, if it was going to show anything punk related. December 1977, prostitute Marilyn Moore attacked and survived. Archive interview of Moore on her attack, being hit 3 times in the head. And when she reaches for him, he backs off. Same tire marks as the scene of Irene Richardson. And Moore remembered her attacker. There was not a drawing sketch, but something called Identikit, which I guess is like a computer, like you enter in the description and it's like a computer generated image. So it shows that. The first time one of those was made for the Ripper, and it shows it. Though I think rough composite sketches were made prior. This is the only one that it mentions. February of 78, Angela Gallup, a forensic scientist, on how she was the first woman to join the forensic lab, how people doubted her at first. And her first crime scene ever was to go to the timber yard where an 18-year-old prostitute Helen Ritka was found. And she goes into the state of the scene, photos and footage of the search at the yard. It goes into the troubled past of Helen and her twin sister Rita, how Rita helped the investigation, but it led nowhere as the public still refused to come forward with any kind of lead or tip of any kind. Uh, old old news interview with Oldfield saying how if an animal is killed, everyone wants to help, but when it's a person, specifically these people, these kinds of people, people don't seem to care. And Oldfield would do a lot of press stuff. Like he was in the media a lot, and it kind of talks about that, but you can see it in the footage that's used. Is that he did a lot of interviews, he did a lot of press conferences. uh, in order to get someone to speak up, they offered a reward of £10,000, but then some private companies were wanting to help out, so they donated. And it ended up being a reward of £30,000. How they started the tip line and how overwhelming that was. And of course, they got bogus tips. Anytime a couple fought, she would call and be like, "My boyfriend or husband is the Ripper," or prank calls. They got a lot of prank calls. So, like anytime there's a tip line, they got a lot of bogus tips, a lot of jaded or vindictive tips, a lot of prank calls. But DeMaio mentions that they filed so much paperwork from every tip. They listened to every tip and did the paperwork and filed it, that someone had to come in and reinforce the floor with concrete because the whole file room was actually caving in because of all the paperwork that was in there. With footage of the file room. It goes into the increasing fear in Yorkshire with random interviews of locals. March 1978, Yvonne Pearson found under a sofa in a rubbish area near the red light district in Bradford, had disappeared 2 months prior, and under her arm was a copy of the Daily Mirror paper dated February 21st, 78, which was 1 month to the day of her murder. So she was killed January 21st, 78. A month later, she's still there, so he puts the paper under her arm, and then they find her another whole month later. Which, yeah, it was like a rubble area. He left her, then he pulled a sofa over her. And it does go into, like, what kind of sick person would not just leave someone or, pile some stuff on top of her, but a whole sofa. Uh, and knowing that the distance of time between the murder, the paper being placed, and then finding her, and the fact that the paper was placed there, they know that the killer's toying with them. News footage, photo of the paper that he left. The tire mark inquiry is abandoned after 5 million vehicles were checked. £5 note, lead still being looked into. More news footage and candid local interviews. Then we go to May 1978. News audio and crime scene footage of 41-year-old Vera Millward found by 2 gardeners on the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary. It goes into how there were 800 staff members and patients at the hospital grounds. The outside was completely floodlit, yet no one saw anything. And so how the killer's getting more risky and more brazen than ever. Green on how the drag marks in the grass show how she had been dragged into an open, obvious spot. Audio of how the public still isn't coming forward, it still doesn't care. Footage of George Oldfield, Ross Hook, who was the Bishop of Bradford, Stephen Shaw, a forensic psychiatrist, to they went on the news talking directly to the camera saying, "Give yourself up." Then it goes into and shows the letter. how the letter mentioned Vera Millward being in the hospital, uh, just prior to her murders, signed Jack the Ripper. It goes into how it was analyzed, and the saliva on the envelope showed him to be blood group B, so he is a secretor, which is one of the rarest blood groups. 6% of men are that, and how this was the biggest break, but then a tape was sent. And it ends with footage of Oldfield and others playing the tape that starts with "I'm Jack." So we get an episode 3, which is called "Reclaim the Night." April 1979, 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker, found dead in Halifax. Wasn't a prostitute. She was more a middle class. With archive footage, news footage, Oldfield saying how now any woman is in danger. Uh, the "Don't Walk Alone" warning, the press conference, Oldfield. There was a press conference with all media, and I think a bunch of people from different precincts. He plays the tape for them, so we get that footage. It plays the tape in its entirety. Uh, Now they believe, based on the accent, because they show that they had some accent expert try to isolate the voice, and he says this from Sunderland or Geordie. Now this will be where they kind of screw themselves, because yes, the tape was a hoax, which it doesn't even really get into that. But being so hell bent on these clues and wanting the outcome to fit the clues, sort of fit the narrative, um, this Geordie accent would actually be more of a roadblock, because then when anyone comes forward saying, "I was attacked, I saw someone attacking someone, I heard their voice," well, did he have a Geordie accent? No, he had a Yorkshire accent. Well, then that's not our guy. We're not even gonna look at him. Which it does go into that, but so now they think the guy has a Geordie accent, which the accent expert isolates it to Castletown more specifically. So then we're introduced to David Zachrison, the detective inspector of Northumbria. On He goes into that house to house inquiries in Castletown. Then we're introduced to Mo Leah, which I hope I pronounced her last name correctly, an art student on becoming part of the punk scene. September 79, Bradford student Barbara Leach is murdered just yards from her home in an alleyway. News footage of the report, news interview with her parents, Beryl and David Leach. Uh, then it goes into the minibus service, now used for co-eds and all women at night. Julie Bindell, part of Women Against Violence Against Women, on incompetent police telling women not to walk alone, pub alone, but men could and women had to be escorted. It goes into Project R being started, which was a £1 million, a project that cost £1 million, on huge advertisements, billboards, news stations playing the Jack tape pretty much on a loop. There were cars with speakers, kind of like Blues Brothers, playing the tape, just so people walking around town could hear it. Shopping centers playing the tape, news stations playing the tape, and also showing the letters on screen for. So if anyone recognized the voice or the handwriting, to call forward. Uh, Footage of police saying or playing the tape at a club. They would even go to clubs and play it over the house system, and people in the club would just listen. Uh, Zachrison on Sunderland not being part of Project R, but how he studied the letters, comparing to and finding similarities in the letters and the Jack the Ripper letters. Similar phrasings, such as, blank gave me fits. So it was obvious that the killer was copying the Jack the Ripper letters, but in his own, like taking phrases and wordings. Uh, and also how the letters were sent before the discovery of Yvonne Pearson and only mentioned things that were public knowledge from the news, believing that it was a hoax. I think that's the last this series mentions of it being a hoax. Like, it doesn't even go into the arrest in, I believe, 2005 uh, of the guy that actually did do the hoax. So then we go back to Molia, who tells her story of going out to the pub with friends the week before her 21st birthday. They separated. She's walking down an alley. A man yells, "Hey," a Yorkshire accent. Didn't recognize him, heard him follow, then felt a blow to the back of her head, survived, woke up in the hospital, goes over all her injuries, and the doctor's telling her her injuries were similar to a Ripper victim. November 1980, the murder of university student uh, Jacqueline Hill, with news footage and audio how two officers found a bloody handbag outside an apartment building. The next day, a passerby finds the body. The officers get called away in between. Which, yeah, these cops found a handbag. Then they got called away. They didn't go back. And then later on, just a passerby finds the body. So then a curfew for women begins. Then it shows footage of the Reclaim the Night march. Then it shows marches in London, Manchester, and York, which that was all women sick of being told not to go out alone, but not just that, also like a feminist movement of, okay, so you ignore the prostitutes, but whenever a good girl is killed, then it's news. Pretty much just protesting the whole attitude towards the victims and women there at that time. But called Reclaim the Night, like if you did your job better, we could walk around at night, or we're not going to let him win by not going out at night. So we're here to reclaim the night. Joan Smith on how she got a job at one of the media outlets, so a woman could actually do a report. It goes over how some of the women were written about in the paper by men, such as assuming some of the earlier victims were prostitutes and wrote very ill of them, assumed who they were, they pushed the idea of a prostitute killer, and how, like, Wilma McCann wasn't the first actual victim, the first murder victim, but there were at least 3 attack survivors prior to her, and how they ignored them because they weren't prostitutes, therefore missing out on key eyewitness accounts. Archive footage of Olive Smelt, a survivor who actually spoke to Sutcliffe, saying he's not a Geordie, he has a Yorkshire accent. So we go to January of 81. A man is seen with a prostitute in his car. His place were ran. Saw he had a vehicle charge. He's brought in. Noticed he looked like a sketch of the Ripper. And then an officer went back to where he was arrested, and he found a hammer and a knife. Then it shows footage of that site, and then episode 3 ends. That's all it gets into for how Peter Sutcliffe was arrested. It doesn't at all go into how Sutcliffe excused himself to the bathroom, and he had another knife on him, so he hid it in like the back of the toilet, which is actually up by the ceiling. He hid it in there, so then they went to the bathroom, they found the knife. How they did a strip search and he was wearing like a V-neck t-shirt as underwear, so his crotch area was open. It doesn't go into any of that. But so then we get into episode 4, which is called Out of the Shadows. Get an archive interview with Sutcliffe's father, finding out he's been arrested. January 1981, press conference on a man being held and questioned in the murders. Archive interview with the prostitute he was with when spotted by police. And then it finally mentions the name Peter William Sutcliffe. 35, lorry driver. It does that in a press conference. Hellowell of Bradford on Sutcliffe being in custody and outlining all the murders in great detail, uh, and on how he was aware of all the leads the police had, such as the tires, the £5 note. It also doesn't get into the lead that they had for how the right boot print was always more prominent. So they were looking into jobs where someone might use their right foot more. Well, they went to this one factory thinking, oh, maybe someone's stepping on a lever or some kind of driver. But so it doesn't really go into that. Footage of the large crowds at Dewsbury Courthouse the day he was to appear, but it was moved to the next day. Footage of the police van driving and 2,000 people going nuts. So then we're introduced to Tracy Brown, and she goes into her attack on August 27th, 1975, when she was 14, and how 2 years later she went to the Keighley news station and how they just kind of laughed at her. Told her, it could. They told her that she wasn't a prostitute. Like, well, it can't be him because you're not a prostitute, and you're, technically, like, you're a child, you're a minor. He doesn't go after minors. You're a student. You're in high school. You don't fit the profile. So, it was just an attacker. We're never going to catch him. Her and Mo Leah recognizing his photo in the Daily Mirror, which is the first time we as the audience get to see a picture of Sutcliffe as well. Archive interview with his Garden Lane neighbor, Anthony O'Callaghan, on how he kept to himself, and then other people on how quiet and off-putting he was. John Sutcliffe, his father, back to that old interview, on how he was as a child. Joan Smith on how he had grown up in an atmosphere where hatred for and violence against women was normalized, and how they were victims, how his father was violent toward his mother. It goes into how the Geordie inquiry was a disaster, but not the PD's fault. The excerpts for the wrong area of the accent, or experts, excuse me, blaming the experts for the wrong area of the accent. Laptew on how he had previously interviewed Sutcliffe on being spotted in the red light district of Manchester, and he wasn't satisfied with him. And it goes into how his boot patterns were similar and how the right sole was thicker. That's the only time it does mention that. And how he looked like the sketch. But he wasn't a Geordie, so his report kind of got put to the bottom of the pile. It goes into how Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times on five different reasons, like that. He was interviewed for the £5 note, was interviewed, all these different leads and reasons. He popped up for all of them. So interviewed 9 times by police. April of 81, trial begins at the Old Bailey Courthouse. News footage of the people outside, audio of the charges, 13 murders, 7 attempted murders. It goes into Sutcliffe's statement on the stand that it all started when he was a gravedigger, heard the voice of God telling him to kill prostitutes, how he was said to have paranoid schizophrenia, how his wife, Sonia, also suffered from it. And so then the debate on whether he had it or how he was able to fake it because he was married to one. He knew how to act it. May of 81, after 6-hour deliberation, he's found guilty of murder, not the manslaughter that he pled to. Archive footage of families leaving the courthouse and being interviewed. The ostracizing of policemen involved for negligence and incompetence. Chief Constable Ronald Gregory possibly being sued by Jacqueline Hill's mother. He was actually pushed to retirement the following year. It then ended up selling his story. George Oldfield moved to traffic and criminal records. It doesn't even mention how Oldfield suffered a heart attack towards the end of the investigation. He suffered a heart attack, and then he was if I remember correctly, he was more of like a consultant after that. It was like in the final months of the investigation. It also doesn't mention how the father of one of the victims died of a heart attack, pretty much around the same time he had a heart attack. March of '84, Sutcliffe is transferred after convincing authorities or experts that he was suffering from mental illness. We get footage of that. Hallowell on subsequently investigating possible other murders, eliminating 10 of 20, and going into how he felt when he went to go interview Sutcliffe. And so then, November 1992, Tracy Brown, on being told Sutcliffe confessed to her attack, but not being charged as he's already serving for 13 murders. She does go into, I do want my justice, but all I have to do is go on with my life. How people still remember it after 40 years. How we should remember the victims, leave him in the shadows. And then it shows photos of all 13 victims. And then with photos and text, it says, in 1981, Sutcliffe confessed to the murder of Marguerite Walls. In August of 1980, she became the 13th victim. And then it goes away, but her name stays there, and then all the other names pop up. And so that is the 4 episodes of the Netflix docuseries, The Ripper. I mean, going at it from just the angle of the investigation, I still enjoyed it. I do feel like it still left a lot out. It's not as in-depth as other investigation procedural docuseries that I've seen. Just looking at the Netflix ones, I would say that the Night Stalker one is more in-depth. I mean, there was a lot that I remember just from the TV movie of This Is Personal, which stuff that I looked into, and yeah, it was accurate, looking into the right soul being thicker or more worn. That's what it was. They noticed that the right blueprint was more worn. It doesn't go into that or how they looked into it. George Oldfield's heart attack. The was quite a bit that it left out, and I was kind of curious as to why. Not really a whole lot of aftermath. Like, it doesn't go into Peter Sutcliffe's several attacks that he had in prison. At least 5 or 6 serious attacks on him, and how he died in 2020, but I mean, it's still decent. It's still very interesting. It's still engrossing. It does have a lot of archive footage, which does help. I probably would have liked it more if maybe the first half was the investigation, the second was more Peter Sutcliffe. This has less about Sutcliffe than the Night Stalker one had on Ramirez. So it's not the most in-depth. It's not, definitely little to nothing on Sutcliffe. I can see people disliking it just for that. I can see people disliking it just because it's more about the investigation, not the murders itself. But I thought it was presented in a very well-made way. The interviews all look great. A lot of the dramatizations were shot very, very well. Have a very David Fincher look to the dramatizations. I would say any Peter Sutcliffe special or episode of something like World's Most Evil Serial Killers, Programmed to Kill, Born to Kill, anything like that, would be more enlightening, or any book, probably, but this kind of just gives you the gist, and it almost feels like they are kind of coming out and saying, yeah, we effed up, but it also kind of tries to say, well, it wasn't our fault. I will say that the angle or focus of feminism is not as bad as people make it out to be. You go look up reviews on IMDb, people hate this because they think it went woke or got hijacked by feminism. Feminism is a huge integral part of this story. I would say it's more relevant to this documentary than the Ted Bundy Falling for a Killer series, which I get why they put that in there. But I thought all the feminism stuff, it was relevant. It was part of the story. It was actually pretty subtle up until it got to all the marches and that one woman, Joan Smith. But still a fair documentary. It's still worth your time if you're interested in the case. There's still stuff worth learning and watching. Just because it doesn't focus on Sutcliffe doesn't mean it's bad. But yeah, I still thought it was good. Not the best that Netflix has to offer, but I still enjoyed it. So yeah, that is The Ripper. I'm not sure which one I'll be doing next. There's a few others I want to check out. But stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.